Let's visit the home studio of Audry Deal-McEver, a potter who's going to share with us how she throws a pot, carves into it, glazes, and fires it from start to finish. Let's go.
Hi, my name's Audry Deal-McEver, and I'm a potter. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and I've been working with clay for about, going on 12 or 13 years now. I first got started in clay in college, which I started off studying photography in college, and I do photography as well. But it's kind of a funny story the way I ended up in ceramics, because the first clay class I took, I actually didn't like at all. My teacher and I didn't get along that well. He was one of those very stern guys who just didn't have much to say in terms of how hard I was working or how successful my work was. And quite frankly, my work wasn't all that good, so I don't blame him. But he didn't have anything positive to say. And he really frustrated me. And this thing happened where I got so determined to prove to him that I could do this, despite the fact I wasn't any good, that I started working really, really hard. And about halfway through the semester, he pulled me aside on a Friday night. It was probably about 10 p.m. and all my friends were out doing fun things, and I was there working in the studio. And he said, "Audrey, do you actually like this, or are you just this studious?" And I had to think, well, I don't know. And I started to realize I do like this. And I changed my major to study ceramics too, and I've been working clay ever since. So this is my home studio, and I'm going to show you how to throw a vase. First step in preparing clay is to wedge it. And basically, this is like mixing or kneading bread dough. But it does two things. First thing it does is get all the air bubbles out of it. And then the second thing it does is it helps align the clay particles. Clay is made up of these little shingles that kind of look like the shingles on your house. And they're floating back and forth on water. And clay works best when you get all those shingles aligned. So, as I'm mixing this, you can see it starting to spiral around. And that's helping align those particles. But the way you can check yourself to see how well it's mixed is by cutting in half with a wire tool. And that's what you want to see. There shouldn't be any little holes in it. A hole would tell me that I have air pockets. Air pockets make it very difficult to use the clay when it's on the potter's wheel. So I am going to throw a vase on the potter's wheel. And so far my setup here, I have my splash pans, which are going to catch all the goo that flies off the wheel. I have my bat. A bat is just a plate that you throw your pot on top of, and the nice thing about the bat is you can lift it up and move it without touching your wet gooey pot, which makes things easier, especially when you're working big. Then I have some clay tools. This is a needle tool. I have a wooden knife that I'll use to trim the bottom corner. And then I have all these different rib tools, and it's a funny name. In England, they call them rubber kidneys, which I think is quite good. But these are used for shaping the clay. So the idea here is that you can bend these and flex them into different stencils and then push the clay out into that shape. So you'll see me use that after I throw the basic cylinder and I want to push it out into some curves. And then, most important of all, I have a bucket with a little bit of water and a sponge, because it's almost impossible to throw a pot when the clay gets really sticky and dry. I already made a kind of ball shape of clay, and I'm slapping it down on the wheel to make sure it really sticks. It takes a good bit of force there. And what you're not seeing is a pedal I have down here. I guess I can hold it up, but this is an electric wheel, which means it has a pedal kind of like a car that makes it spin faster as you push it, and it stops when you push the back. But there are wheels that don't require electricity too, called kick wheels. I just don't happen to have one of those. So before I can actually start making my vase, I have to do what's called centering. And centering is what makes all the clay smooth and completely in the center of the wheel so that I can manipulate it without getting wiggles and bumps that would throw off the shape. So I'm pushing forward with my left hand, I'm pushing down with my right hand, and this is feeling pretty good. It's not wiggling the way it was when I first put it on the wheel. Let me push on one more time just to be sure. Well, that feels pretty good. And since I'm throwing a shape that's going to be tall and narrow, I'm centering into a kind of tall and more narrow shape too. If I was throwing a plate or a bowl, something that was going to be low and wide, I'd have a shape that was much lower and wider already. So before I open this up, I'm using my thumbs to pre-drill a little belly button in the top. I'm using my pointer fingers to push that hole down until I just have a little bit of clay left below it. So I can use my needle tool to poke down and take a measurement of how much clay I have in the base, and that's pretty ideal. My goal is to have that thickness match the thickness of my walls when I'm done. So now I'm pulling back to stretch this hole out and make it a little wider. I'm compressing the bottom with my pointer finger just to help make sure that clay is good and strong, because clay loves to crack when you forget to compress it. And now I'm going to pull the walls. So when I pull the walls, the idea is I'm going to squeeze and slide my hands up to stretch the clay upwards. And the speed I do this at and the direction that I pull my hands at, all those details are really important, because the clay is just going to follow my hands. And if I lean out when I do this, it's going to start making a shape like this. If I lean in, it's going to start leaning same direction. And since my vase is going to be tall and start with a pretty straight shape, I need to be very careful with the way I do this. This is the hardest part when throwing. Alright, so I think I'm done pulling. I'm checking by just running my fingers down the walls, and I'm checking for areas that might feel a little thicker or thinner than others. I can tell that very bottom corner has just a little bit of thickness. I think I just fixed that. So, I think I'm good to proceed to shaping. So before I shape this too much, I have to go ahead and get all the water out of the inside of the pot. So I'm starting by using this metal rib to push a little bit of a curve into the base, because I like vase shapes that kind of curve in before they swell out. I think that's looking good. I'm going to flip this around and start pushing the clay out into the curve of this rib tool. And this is scraping some clay off, but that's alright. The clay it's taking off is just that wet and squishy clay on the edge called slip. Next, I'm using my hands to do what's called collaring, to squeeze in the top and make it a little bit more narrow. And that's going to be the neck of the vase. Pots have parts named after human bodies. So like on this vase I'm already done with, this would be the foot. You have the shoulder, you have the waist or the neck, and then the very top is called the lip.
The next step for Audrey is to finish cleaning up her vase. She's shaping it, getting it exactly as she wants to, because once she takes her vase off the potter's wheel, she cannot go back and change the look of it. She also looks at the vase from the side to check what she calls the profile of the vase, to see how the body is forming. As she mentioned, how it curves in and swells back out. Now she's just cleaning it up a bit before taking it very carefully off of the wheel.
All right, so this is a vase that I threw on the potter's wheel last night. I left it out to dry since then, and now this is at a stage that we call leather hard, meaning you can pick it up, you can handle it, manipulate it, it's not squishy. However, it's still soft enough for me to change just a little bit. So I couldn't change the shape anymore, but this is a great time to clean this up and do detail work.
Before carving into the vase, Audrey spends some time with a damp sponge, making sure that it's nice and smooth, getting rid of any irregularities. Now let's listen to her inspiration from India.
The way that patterns like this started off as actual plants that were being drawn in a really lifelike way. And people with a lot of money were paying really talented artists to go out and document these plants, and then they would hang up the drawings in their homes and their palaces. But this became so fashionable that the ordinary person who didn't have as much money also wanted to decorate their homes in this fashion. And they started hiring artists who were not quite as technically advanced. So what they got was a slightly more cartoony version of an actual plant. And then other artists started copying that style, and it started getting even more and more stylized. And then England and other European countries came in and said, ooh, I really like that pattern, but can you make it a little more swirly and purple? And eventually you ended up with patterns like paisley that don't look anything like an actual plant. There's some paisley. But I think it's really interesting the way that some of these actually have roots in very exact nature drawings.
With that inspiration in mind, Audrey mentioned that she oftentimes closes that book and sets it aside. She doesn't want to copy patterns, she wants to be inspired by patterns. So, knowing that, she closes the book, puts it away, and uses her mind and her imagination to create the beautiful designs on her vases. She's carving and also puncturing into the side of the vase with a variety of tools. Some of them are tools that are a little bit out of the ordinary, like a broken paintbrush does a great job of creating a perfect circle. The back of a paintbrush creates an awesome dot. And she uses special clay tools to carve into her pots. These make for beautiful, unique designs for her works of art. I asked her how could she possibly carve so many pots so quickly? She said it's because she's been carving into pots just like this for a long time. She has what she calls an artistic vocabulary. She knows exactly what she plans to draw before she starts to draw it. That way, drawing comes a lot faster and easier for her. It also means she doesn't have to spend time going back and erasing, which would be pretty difficult to do on the side of a clay pot. Once these pieces are finished, they are going to need to dry out completely before they can be fired in a kiln. Audrey is what's called a production potter. That means, as she said, time is money. She needs to work quickly so that her pots can be produced in mass, meaning when she goes to sell them, she'll have plenty of pots for people to pick and choose from. Once Audrey is finished carving her design on her vase, she spends quite a bit of time making sure to remove any little pieces of clay that might be sticking out of her piece. Any small pieces of clay or rough edges, once that piece is fired and glazed in the kiln, can actually become razor sharp and can cause somebody to cut themselves if they were handling the vase. So it's very important that she spend time making sure all of her edges are smooth. She does that with her damp sponge and a dry brush, just to kind of remove any of those little bits and pieces of clay. When Audrey was working, she chatted a lot about good craftsmanship, meaning to spend a lot of time making a work of art that people will really stop, take notice of, admire, and want to purchase. Good craftsmanship is vital to an artist who is looking to share their masterpiece with others, and Audrey made sure to spend a good amount of time on her craftsmanship.
So my little vase here is now finished, and the next step in the process is firing it. But first it has to dry out completely. If I were to fire this pot that's still a little wet, it would explode in the kiln if I didn't wait for it to dry completely. So I'm going to put this aside and show you what a piece looks like that has been sitting out a little longer. So this is now completely dried out. This is called greenware, and it's bone dry. So that's why it looks a little more white. And even though I can hold this, it's still extremely fragile. If I just barely nicked this on the side of the kiln, it would shatter so easily. So you have to be very careful at this point. But after all the water is dried, I can actually put this in the kiln and fire it. So this is my kiln. It's a Scott brand kiln, and it's electric, although there are all different types of kilns. So historically, people fired using wood as their fuel source, and early kilns were next to the clay source. Oftentimes they'd make little pit firings where they dig a hole in the ground and put both the pottery and a bunch of wood, catch them on fire, try to get as hot as they can, because the temperature you fire to, the hotter it is, the more durable your piece is. But eventually, people were frustrated because they couldn't get hot enough just in a pit in the ground. So then they started getting a little smarter, and they started digging holes into the sides of hills and actually firing inside the earth, because that would insulate the fire and let them get it even hotter. So they were building onigama kilns. Eventually, people started firing with gas, and there's still a lot of potters using gas kilns. Those are great because they heat up very quickly, but oftentimes you're manually controlling those. Sometimes they're hooked up to computers, but most of the time, these days, electric kilns will be found in pottery studios. First of all, they're a little smaller and more compact. They don't require giant chimneys like wood kilns, and they don't require a gas line. And they have these computers that help run the program of the firing. So if I were to just load this up and hit on, the pieces wouldn't survive. You have to instead fire very slowly through different temperature ranges, because clay goes through molecular changes as it gets hot, and eventually it converts to being something that's very durable and stone-like. My clay is called white stoneware, so it actually turns into stone-like material. So you have to be very strategic about how quickly you fire. And sometimes I'll fire fast up to a certain temperature, then I'll slow down, then I'll go a little faster, and the computer controls that for me after I program it. So an electric kiln is basically like a giant toaster oven. It's made of this material called soft brick that's different than the brick on your house because it's designed to insulate. It's not so structural. That's why when you see the outside, there's a metal casing. That's what actually holds it together and makes it strong and durable. But this brick helps hold in the heat, which is important because I'm going to fire this up well over 1,000 degrees. For my first firing, I'm going to go up to about 1,800 degrees. So this is what holds the heat in. And then down here you can see these electric elements. And they look very similar to what's inside a toaster. Those are what create the heat. They'll end up being glowing red when this gets turned on. And then I also have a computer that controls the speed that those elements fire at. After a piece comes out of the kiln, it is what we call bisqueware, which means it's hard now. I can actually hold this, but it's still not quite as durable as it will be because the bisque firing is to a lower temperature. But the goal here is to end up with a piece that's very porous and hard enough to be handled for glazing. But we are going to fire this another time to actually make it finalized. It'll be colorful, shiny, it will be strong. You can actually use it with food at that point. So this is just part of the way finished still. And the next step is glazing. So glazes come in all different colors, but the way they work really has more to do with chemistry than it does with the way you would mix paint. Paint has a binder material in it, which is what makes it stick to whatever you paint it on. And glaze doesn't usually have that. Glaze instead is just a bunch of different colored oxides, things like iron, cobalt, copper, lots of things that you'd find on the periodic table. Those combine with different glass formers that actually create the glaze. Some are shiny, some are matte, some are translucent, some are opaque. There's all different types of glazes, and there are also different glazes designed for different temperature ranges. So you have to be careful when you pick a glaze to make sure it will be a good fit for the clay and for the kiln firing you're using. So I've mixed up my glaze already, and I put it in this little squirt bottle. And this is my favorite way to glaze. This is not necessarily how most people glaze.
Audrey shared with me that the reason she uses that small tool you're seeing is because it allows her to get inside the small crevices that she initially carved into her pot. She also said that, like many glazes, the color of this one is actually going to change and be a little bit more greenish, which will be perfect for the stems and the leaves. She also uses other colors, as you can see here, on her works of art. Once out of the kiln, the pots are beautifully colored and they've been covered with a coat of clear glaze. Big thanks to Audrey for sharing her amazing process with us, from the creation of a vase to allowing it to dry and carve into it, and to the beautiful results that her glazing technique share. It has been wonderful to spend time in Audrey's studio. Thank you so very much, Audry Deal-McEver.